Following its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons against Western countries that support Ukraine. The threats have become so commonplace that the West has largely ignored them, and in the case of France's President Emmanuel Macron, he responded to a Russian nuclear threat with a nuclear threat of his own. What is Russia's objective in consistently threatening the tactical nuclear option against supporters of Ukraine? Is it all a bluff, or does it serve the purpose? The first thing to note about Russia's nuclear threat is that it is a tactical one rather than a strategic one. This means that Russia is not threatening the homelands, mainly those of the United States, the United Kingdom and France, with nuclear warfare. A strategic nuclear threat would broaden the battlefield beyond Ukraine's immediate borders. The primary goal of limiting the threat to tactical nuclear weapons is to isolate and restrict the extent of the war in Ukraine. Remember, using a nuclear weapon, whether tactical or strategic, is a strategic decision that affects more than just the intended nuclear target. Russia initially disguised its invasion as a military exercise, which involved the deployment and simulated use of tactical nuclear weapons. The exercise's deployment and simulated use of tactical nuclear weapons served as an initial nuclear shield when Russia invaded Ukraine. Although the West may not have suspected it, the Russians deliberately included tactical nuclear weapons in the exercise to give the West pause to not directly intervene militarily in the Ukraine invasion. The Russian integration of nuclear weapons into its pre-invasion exercise was an intentional part of the pre-invasion deployments that had a carryover effect once the invasion started. In March 2022, Russia announced that it was deploying some of its tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus and training Belarusian troops in the use of the weapons. The initial threat to the city of Kyiv originated from Belarus, a Russian ally who permitted the use of its territory in the initial invasion of Ukraine. The Russians extended tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus as that part of the offensive failed, retreated, and eventually withdrew completely. This provided Belarus with a level of deterrence against Ukraine, as well as the 3 NATO countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland that share a border with Belarus. The tactical deployments to Belarus and the announcement of nuclear drills in Kaliningrad were intended to caution NATO against intervening against Belarus and aid Russia in further isolating the northern front of the Ukraine battlefield. After the invasion, the threat of tactical nuclear weapons also served to temper Western support for Ukraine. Not only did it prevent any immediate intervention by NATO countries, but it also nearly eliminated an overwhelming NATO response post-invasion. Russia has had time to adapt to the West's shaping of the battlefield in response to the growing threats, thanks to the slow and deliberate escalation of weapons sent to Ukraine. Even after the latest changes in Ukraine, the use of Western-donated weapons against targets within Russia did not occur until the 3rd year of the war, and even now the Biden administration continues to impose stipulations aimed at controlling the war's escalation. The situation is significantly influenced by Russia's tactical nuclear threats against NATO countries' support for Ukraine. Russia has effectively used the threat of nuclear weapons to slow down and shape the type of assistance the West has provided to Ukraine. The only deliberate and planned use of the nuclear threat occurred during the initial exercise in January and February 2022, which preceded the invasion, with the aim of limiting the Western response. The other uses of the nuclear threat have been somewhat haphazard, aimed at influencing Western support for Ukraine, and do not form part of a larger plan. This is safe to say because Russia was almost certainly not planning for the Ukraine war to last a few months at most and not a few years. Russia and NATO are in unknown territory. Both sides, with their Cold War experience, are well versed in the use of nuclear deterrence. They are also both well aware that 2 nuclear-armed adversaries have not fought a major war against each other, and that there is danger in not knowing what event will precipitate the use of nuclear weapons. Russia recognizes that the initial deployment of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, even targeting solely Ukrainian targets, would trigger a significant NATO response, compelling it to join the war. So neither Russia nor NATO will be the first to use nuclear weapons under the current status quo. The question becomes, why continue the tactical nuclear saber rattling if it is in its interest not to use nuclear weapons first? The NATO countries appear to be ignoring the Russian nuclear threats and continue to slowly increase the lethality and rules of engagement of their donated weapons, so they appear to be ignoring Russia's threats. However, this assertion should not be taken at face value. The NATO countries are still only incrementally changing their policies for fear of escalating a war with Russia. NATO knows that Russia will not strike first as long as the status quo remains, but what happens if the Western response changes the battlefield and the status quo changes rapidly? The status quo will only change if there is a rapid and massive shift on the Ukrainian battlefield, and the West is careful not to let that happen. NATO maintaining the status quo and only incrementally increasing aid ensures the status quo does not change in Ukraine, at least in the context of Western aid. The Western allies of Ukraine are using the Russian tactical nuclear threat to maintain this deterrent mindset. Russia is using the tactical nuclear threat in the Ukraine war as a tool to prevent the battlefield from widening and to consolidate its position in the region. Its threats have eliminated the threat of direct Western intervention in Ukraine for the first 2 years of the war, and we have now only seen the token non-combat deployment of 1,500 French troops in Ukraine. The fear of escalating a war with Russia has shaped the parameters of Western military support for Ukraine, leading to declarations by most supporting countries that they are solely assisting Ukraine and do not wish to engage in a conflict with Russia. Russia has utilized this to its advantage, primarily attributing the threat of its nuclear forces to itself. Russia's use of tactical nuclear threats has been an integral part of allowing Russia to operate inside Ukraine and limit and temper the Western response, thus co-opting the West into maintaining the Ukraine invasion status quo.